For centuries, this redbone forest had been the bleeding ground between the territories of the Ironwood Pack and the Sanguine Court. Tonight, it would be soaked anew. Kylan, alpha of the Ironwood Pack, moved through the chaos like a force of nature. His massive, gray-furred form was a blur of muscle and fury, each swipe of his claws rending the unnaturally pale flesh of the vampires that swarmed him. His roar was not just sound. It was a tremor that shook the very roots of the trees, a beacon of defiance for his pack. But the vampires of the Sanguine Court were numberless, a tide of shadows and sharp, smiling teeth. They fought with a chilling silence, their movements fluid and precise against the raw, explosive power of the werewolves. They knew their goal: decapitate the pack, and the body would wither. Kylan found himself isolated, a stone in the river of the enemy. He'd fought too deep, his rage carrying him beyond the main line of his warriors. A vampire, faster than the others, latched onto his back, its cold fingers digging into his fur. Kylan roared, spinning and crushing it against an oak, but the distraction cost him. Another darted in, and another. A searing pain, cold as ice and sharp as a shard of glass, shot through his forearm. He snarled, shaking off the leech-like creature to see two punctures, deep and weeping black blood, already rimed with a faint, crystalline frost. A vampire's bite. Not just a wound, but a poison. The cold began to spread, a lethargic venom seeping into his veins, dulling the fire in his muscles. His movements slowed. His powerful swings became clumsy. The vampires sensed his weakness, closing in like vultures, their eyes gleaming with crimson victory. This was how an alpha fell. Not in a glorious last stand, but picked apart by scavengers. Leave him. The voice was a thunderclap, a promise of violence that cut through the din of battle. Marcus, the beta, erupted from the tree line. He was slightly smaller than Kylan, his fur a deep, earthy brown, but his speed was unmatched. He moved with a focused, brutal efficiency. He didn't roar, he simply tore through the vampires surrounding his alpha. A head was ripped from its shoulders. A spine was shattered against a knee. He was a whirlwind of protective fury, clearing a space around Kylan in mere seconds. Panting, Marcus stood over his alpha, his body a shield. He glanced back, his golden eyes taking in the unnatural pallor of Kylan's fur around the bite, the way the alpha's great frame shuddered. "Marcus! The flank! They're breaking," Kylan growled, his voice a ragged whisper. He tried to stand, to push forward, but his legs buckled. The cold was in his chest now, clutching at his heart. Marcus ignored the command. His eyes were locked on the bite. "The venom," he muttered, his voice low and grim. "I saw what it did to Lorcan. You're not dying today, Alpha." Before Kylan could protest further, Marcus shifted his weight, heaving the massive, semi-conscious Alpha onto his back with a grunt of effort. Kylan was a dead weight, the strength leaching from his body by the second. "No." Kylan slurred, his claws feebly scraping against Marcus's fur. "My place is here, with the pack. Leave me." Marcus ignored him. He turned his back on the battle, on the howls of his brothers and sisters, and began to run. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Every instinct, every fiber of his being as beta, screamed at him to turn around and die fighting beside his pack. But a deeper loyalty, a primal bond that transcended even duty, drove him forward. He ran like the wind, his powerful legs eating up the ground, carrying them away from the sounds of clashing steel and dying screams, deeper into the safe territory of the Ironwood. "Stop, Marcus. I order you." Kylan's voice was fading, his consciousness slipping away despite his iron will. "I cannot stop," Marcus panted, his breath pluming in the cold night air. "Not until I get the poison out of your system. The bite is more dangerous than the blade, Kylan. It will stop your heart." He felt the last vestige of tension leave Kylan's body. The Alpha's head lolled against his neck, completely unconscious. The weight felt infinitely heavier now. The burden of command, of a life, of a future, was his alone to carry. Marcus ran faster, the forest blurring around him. He was abandoning the battlefield, betraying the very essence of the warrior code. But he was saving his alpha. He was saving his brother. And as the silence of the deep woods enveloped them, broken only by the sound of his own frantic footfalls and labored breathing, Marcus knew that if the pack survived this night, the consequences of his choice would haunt him forever. But for now, there was only the run, the weight on his back, and the desperate race against a cold, creeping death. Few days later, in an unmarked territory, Lucas battled for survival. A scream tore from Kylan's throat, a raw, guttural sound that had nothing to do with the wolf and everything to do with a soul in torment. He wasn't in the Blackwood. He was in a throne room of bone and shadow, forced to his knees. Before him, his pack, his proud, fierce pack, shuffled in chains, their eyes hollow. And on the throne sat Vargo, the voice lord, his features sharp as a razor, a cruel smile playing on his lips as he placed a crown of twisted blackened iron onto the head of a cowering wolf. The crown sizzled, and the wolf howled in agony. Kylan jolted upright, the phantom smell of burnt fur and despair clogging his nostrils. The world was soft, quiet, and wrong. Panic, pure and instinctual, seized him. He was not where he was supposed to be. His pack was suffering. He scrambled off the low cot, his legs tangling in a rough-spun blanket. The cold bite of the venom was gone, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache in his arm, but his muscles were water. His feet hit the floor and immediately buckled, sending him crashing to the wooden planks beside a small, wooden stool. A girl, who had been sitting on that stool, jumped back with a startled gasp. She was human, young, with wide eyes the color of summer leaves and hair the shade of wheat. She reached a tentative hand toward him. "You're awake. Please, you're not well. Don't touch me." Kylan snarled, swatting her hand away. His vision swam, the room tilting. He saw her not as a girl, but as a servant of Vargo, a jailer in this strange, scented prison. He tried to push himself up, to get to the door, to run back to the bleeding wound of the Blackwood. The door flew open, and Marcus filled the frame, his face etched with a week's worth of worry and exhaustion. In a second, he was at Kylan's side, his strength a solid anchor in the storm of Kylan's panic. "Easy, Alpha. Easy," Marcus murmured, his voice low and steady. He hooked an arm under Kylan's shoulders, effortlessly bearing his weight and guiding him back onto the cot. Kylan fought him, but it was a feeble struggle, his body betraying his will. "Where are we?" Kylan growled, his chest heaving. His golden eyes, wild and unfocused, darted around the room. It was small, filled with the smell of dried herbs, antiseptic, and something sweet, honey. A bandage, clean and white, was wrapped tightly around his forearm where the vampire's fangs had sunk in. "The human world," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "A healer's house." It was the only place safe enough, far enough from Vargo's reach to draw the venom out. The memories crashed over Kylan then, sharp and shameful. The bite. The cold. The battlefield. His battlefield. He saw himself, weak, being hauled onto Marcus's back like a sack of grain. He heard his own voice, choked but clear, ordering Marcus to leave him. His hand shot out, faster than a striking snake, and clamped around Marcus's throat. The girl cried out, but Kylan ignored her, his fury giving him a fleeting strength. "I told you to leave me." Kylan seethed, his fingers pressing into the beta's flesh. "I told you to let me die with my pack. My place was there, not in some human hovel, hiding like a coward while my people burn." Marcus didn't fight back. He stood rigid, accepting the punishment, his eyes filled not with fear, but with a profound, stubborn loyalty. "Please," the girl begged, stepping forward, her hands clasped together. "He hasn't left your side. He carried you for miles. He saved your life." Kylan's gaze flickered to her desperate face, then back to Marcus's unwavering one. The fire in him sputtered and died, replaced by a cold, heavy ash of despair. He released his grip, and Marcus took a half-step back, rubbing his neck but saying nothing. Kylan swung his legs off the bed again, this time managing to stand, though the room swayed. "It doesn't matter. I'm going back." "Kylan," Marcus began, his voice thick with warning. I saw them, Marcus. Kylan roared, turning on him. In the dream. I saw Vargo on my throne. I saw our people in chains. I know what happened. Marcus stood his ground, his own pain finally breaking through his stoic facade. Then you know it's not a battlefield to rush back to. It's a fortress. The Blackwood is lost. The territory is his. The pack that survived, is enslaved. Kylan's shoulders slumped. The confession, spoken aloud, made the nightmare real. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of an alpha. He knew. Of course he knew. The bond he shared with his pack was a silent chorus in his blood, and now it was a discordant dirge of pain and submission. He looked at Marcus, truly looked at him. He saw the exhaustion, the grief, the fresh scars that mapped a desperate escape. He saw the human girl, her compassion a stark contrast to the world he had just left. I know, Kylan whispered, the words tasting like ash. And I don't care. He took a stumbling step toward the door, a king with no kingdom, a wolf with no pack, driven by a duty that now demanded a suicide mission. Marcus moved to block his path, not with force, but with a silent, desperate plea. The battle for the Blackwood was over. The battle for Kylan's soul had just begun. The world tilted, the simple wooden door swimming in Kylan's vision. The defiant step he'd taken was his last. The strength fled his legs as if the floor had vanished, and he crumpled, his head striking the doorframe with a dull thud before darkness swallowed him once more. He awoke to the faint scent of lavender and the soft crackle of a hearth. This time, there was no nightmare, only a profound, aching emptiness. He was back in the cot, the rough blanket pulled up to his chest. Blinking against the gray light of dawn filtering through a small window, he became aware of two presences. Marcus stood vigil at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his posture radiating a watchful tension. The human girl, Miriam, he remembered her pleading, was perched on her stool, a bowl of steaming broth in her hands. A hot flush of shame crept up Kylan's neck. The memory of his collapse, of his pathetic fury followed by utter weakness, was a fresh humiliation. He turned his face away from them, staring at the rough-hewn wall. How long? He asked, his voice a dry rasp. It was Marcus who answered, his voice carefully neutral. This time, a day. But since the battle, 2 weeks, Kylan. 2 weeks. The words hit him like a physical blow. He recoiled into the thin mattress, the news a greater injury than the vampire's bite. 2 weeks. His pack had been enslaved for 2 weeks while he lay dormant, useless, a king in a coma while his kingdom fell to ruin. The weight of it pressed down on him, making the cot feel like a tomb. He was weak. He was a failure. He heard a faint whisper, the girl's voice, soft and urgent, directed at Marcus. A moment later, the door opened and shut. The heavier presence of his beta was gone, leaving only the quiet, unsettling aura of the human. Kylan kept his face turned away. What do you want? He grumbled, the question meant to push her away. Instead, her voice was steady, clear, and cut through his self-pity with surprising precision. I know you want revenge. I can help you get it. Slowly, deliberately, Kylan turned his head on the pillow. He studied her properly for the first time. She wasn't just a girl. Her green eyes held a depth of sorrow that mirrored his own, but also a flicker of hardened steel. This was not simple human kindness. This was a purpose. Go on, he said, his interest piqued despite himself. My name is Miriam, she said, setting the bowl aside. Vargo and his court didn't just take your home. Months ago, they swept through our village. Not for territory. For a harvest. They killed everyone. My parents. They were just part of the feast. Her voice wavered for a second, then firmed. I survived by hiding in a root cellar. I have my own debt to settle. Kylan said nothing, but his silence was an invitation. There is a flower, she continued, leaning forward slightly. The locals call it sun's tears. It's a poison to vampires. Not a weapon that wounds, but a pollen that, when ignited, creates a choking gas. It sears their lungs from the inside. A grim, cold smile touched Kylan's lips for the first time in weeks. The idea was beautiful in its brutality. This flower. Where does it grow? Miriam met his gaze without flinching. On your lands, Alpha. In the high meadows of the Ironwood territory, where the sun touches the clearings longest. Shock jolted through him. What? I've never heard of such a plant. For a moment, the shame returned. Had he been so focused on war and borders that he was blind to the resources within his own domain? It's considered a weed by your people, Miriam explained gently. Harmless to wolves. You would have no reason to notice it. But we humans, the healers, we know the properties of all things that grow. To harvest enough pollen for a significant attack, we would need to go back. Go back. The two words hung in the air, charged with impossible risk and intoxicating promise. And who is we? Kylan asked, his mind already racing, the lethargy burned away by the spark of a plan. I have no pack to command. You have more than you know, Miriam said. There are other survivors. Humans from neighboring villages who have suffered under Vargo's reign. And there are wolves. Marcus has been in contact. Not all were captured. Some escaped into the deep woods. They are scattered, leaderless, and waiting. They are waiting for you. Kylan pushed himself up, ignoring the protest in his muscles. The hollow feeling was gone, replaced by a familiar, burning purpose. He looked at Miriam, no longer seeing a helpless human girl, but an ally. A strategist. This flower, he said, his voice now the low, commanding rumble of an alpha. Tell me everything. The king was awake, and the war was not over. It was simply entering a new, more cunning phase. The forgotten tunnel was thick with the taste of wet earth and old stone. Kylan led the way, his senses stretched to their limit, every rustle of a rat or drip of water a potential alarm. Behind him moved a ghost of an army, a dozen of his scattered pack, their fur matted and eyes haunted, and a handful of grim-faced human survivors led by Miriam. They were a far cry from the proud warriors of the Ironwood Pack, but they were all he had. Miriam had spoken true. The tunnel, an ancient escape route built by a paranoid ancestor, opened into a dense thicket at the very edge of the woods, directly behind the soaring, oppressive silhouette of the palace that was once his home. The sight of it, now defiled by vampire banners hanging from its spires, sent a fresh wave of fury through Kylan. But he clamped down on it. This was not a mission of rage, but of stealth. The high meadows were just as Miriam had described. Bathed in moonlight, the familiar clearing was dotted with small, unassuming flowers, their silver petals seeming to glow. Sun's tears. The weapon that had been under their noses all along. Quickly and quietly, Kylan murmured, his voice barely a breath. They fanned out, working with an efficient silence born of desperation. They used small scythes and gloved hands, harvesting the flowers and stuffing them into thick, canvas bags. The air filled with a faint, sweet, almost cloying scent. With every bag that filled, a flicker of hope ignited in Kylan's chest. They could do this. They could actually. A twig snapped. It was a small sound, but in the tense silence, it was as loud as thunder. Every head shot up. From the tree line, a pair of crimson eyes gleamed, followed by another, and another. A vampire patrol, drawn by the sound or perhaps the unusual scent. The lead vampire, a sneering creature with a scar across his cheek, smiled. Rats in the garden, he hissed. There was no time for strategy. The world erupted into violence. Kylan shifted in a blur of motion, meeting the vampire's charge with a snarl. Claws met cold flesh. Marcus was a whirlwind at his side, his fighting style even more brutal and efficient than before, a testament to his own bottled-up rage. The humans and wolves fought with the desperate strength of those who had already lost everything. But they were outnumbered. For every vampire they felled, two more seemed to melt from the shadows. The vampires fought with cruel precision, hurting them, cutting off their escape route back to the tunnel. Kylan! Miriam yelled, her voice cutting through the din. She was not a fighter, but she stood her ground, a small knife in her hand. We have to go. Now. If we're caught, this is all for nothing. He saw the truth in her eyes. They had 3 bags full of the precious flowers. It was a start. But his heart screamed at him to fight on, to free the captured wolves who were even now being dragged away in chains, their howls of despair tearing at his soul. Marcus slammed into a vampire about to sink its fangs into Kylan's exposed back. She's right, Alpha, he grunted, shoving the creature back. If you fall here, it's over. There is no hope for any of us. Vargo wins. The words were a cold dash of reality. To die a martyr here would be a selfish indulgence. His duty was not just to those captured tonight, but to every soul under Vargo's thumb. The cost of victory was this moment of unbearable cowardice. Retreat. Kylan roared, the order tasting like ash. To the tunnel. It was a chaotic, bloody scramble. They fought a rearguard action, sacrificing space for lives. Kylan's eyes locked with one of his captured warriors, a young wolf named Finn, whose eyes held not accusation, but a fierce, desperate understanding. Then they were plunging back into the darkness of the tunnel, the sounds of the skirmish and the triumphant cries of the vampires echoing behind them. They collapsed in the damp passage, gasping for air, the few bags of Sun's tears lying between them like sacred relics. Kylan stood at the mouth of the tunnel, staring back towards his stolen home, his body trembling not with fatigue, but with a vow made of iron and grief. I will come back for you, he whispered into the darkness, his promise carried on the cold tunnel air. I swear it on my blood and bone. This is not over. He turned to his ragged band, his eyes burning with a new, terrifying light. Now, we make them choke. At the pack, the grand hall of the Ironwood Lodge, once filled with the warmth of pack and the scent of pine, was now a cavern of cold shadows. The trophies of the hunt that once adorned the walls were replaced with banners of deep crimson and black. At the head of the room, on the great oak throne that had been Kylan's birthright, sat Lord Vargo. He was a study in elegant menace. He did not slouch or sprawl. He was perfectly still, his long, pale fingers steepled under his chin. His eyes, the color of old blood, surveyed the line of prisoners dragged before him. The captured werewolves, including the young warrior Finn, were bound in cruel silver chains that smoked faintly against their skin, sapping their strength and silencing their wolves. The humans stood beside them, held by brute force alone. A silence stretched, thick and heavy. Vargo finally spoke, his voice a soft, hypnotic melody that seemed to slither into the mind. The Alpha Kylan lives, he stated, the words not a question but a condemnation. He skulks in the shadows while his people bear the weight of his failure. Why did he return? What did he seek in his own ruined home? He let the question hang in the air. No one answered. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the wolves and the soft, defiant spit of one of the human men that landed on the polished floor at the foot of the dais. Vargo's lips curled into a faint, chilling smile. He rose, his movement fluid and unnaturally graceful. He descended the steps until he stood before the line of prisoners. Loyalty is such a cumbersome virtue, he murmured, his gaze drifting over their faces. It leads to such unnecessary suffering. Tell me what I wish to know, and the suffering ends. Still, no one spoke. Finn lifted his head, meeting Vargo's gaze with a glare of pure hatred. Very well, Vargo sighed, as if disappointed by a child's stubbornness. He stopped in front of the human who had spat. With a movement too fast to follow, his hand shot out, fingers closing around the man's throat. There was a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the floor, lifeless. A collective gasp, followed by a growl of fury from the wolves, rippled through the captives. Vargo moved to the next prisoner, a young werewolf female. He didn't touch her. He simply looked at the vampire guard holding her. The guard drew a silver-edged dagger and, without ceremony, plunged it into her heart. She died without a sound, her body slumping against her chains. Panic began to bloom in the eyes of some of the humans. The brutal, casual efficiency of the slaughter was breaking their resolve where threats had failed. Vargo reached a third prisoner. He raised a hand, poised to give the order. Wait. The voice was shrill with terror. A man, thin and trembling, stumbled forward. I'll talk. I'll tell you. Just let me go. Promise I can walk away. Cries of traitor and coward erupted from his comrades. Finn snarled, straining against his silver bonds. Silence him. Vargo held up a hand, and the shouts were cut off as if by a knife. He looked at the trembling man with open fascination, like a scientist observing a rare insect. You have my audience, Vargo said, his voice dripping with condescending charm. Speak. Your freedom is the price. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting everywhere but at his former allies. Take the flowers, he stammered. The sun's tears. In the high meadow. They came for the flowers. To make a poison, a gas. To use against you. A profound silence fell over the hall. Vargo's expression did not change, but a new, cold light ignited in his blood-red eyes. The strategy was clever. Far cleverer than he would have credited to a brute like Kylan. Thank you, Vargo said, his voice soft and sincere. You have been most helpful. A wave of relief washed over the man's face. He even managed a weak, grateful smile. So, I can go. Of course, Vargo said. Then, with the same blinding speed, his hand shot out. His fingers, sharp as talons, pierced the man's chest and closed around his heart. The man's eyes widened in shock and betrayal before going blank. Vargo let the body drop to join the others on the floor. I despise a betrayer, Vargo announced to the hall, wiping his hand fastidiously on a silk handkerchief produced by a servant. Their loyalty is a coin they will always spend for the right price. It has no value. He turned his back on the horrified captives and ascended to his throne. Lock the rest away. They may yet serve as bait. He settled into the carved oak, his gaze turning inward, toward a new, more pressing threat. And send out the hunters. Track the fugitive Alpha. He has a plan, and I will not have it come to fruition. Find his hiding place and put an end to this floral insurrection. The game had changed. Kylan was no longer a broken ghost, he was a strategist with a weapon. And for that, Vargo decided, he would have to be eradicated with extreme prejudice. At the safe house, the cloying sweet scent of crushed sun's tears saturated the atmosphere. Kylan, Marcus, and Miriam hunched over a rough-hewn table, a map of the Ironwood territory spread before them. Small, dried flowers were scattered across the parchment like strategic tokens. The main gate is too heavily fortified, Marcus grumbled, his finger tracing the palace walls. But the old aqueduct, here, it leads directly into the lower dungeons. We could. A distant, sharp crack echoed through the night, followed by the unmistakable snarl of a wolf and a triumphant, shrieking cry. All three froze. Before they could move, the door to the safe house burst open. A young werewolf, his fur matted with dirt and a fresh bleeding gash on his shoulder, stood panting in the frame. My Alpha! They found us! The processing lab, they're destroying everything! A cold dread, colder than any vampire's bite, seized Kylan's heart. He shoved past the messenger, Marcus and Miriam at his heels. They sprinted through the hidden camp, the sounds of battle growing louder. The scene that greeted them was one of utter devastation. The makeshift laboratory, a sheltered cave where they had been drying and grinding the precious flowers, was a wreck. Tables were overturned, clay pots shattered, and the air was thick with the potent, wasted pollen of sun's tears, making even their own eyes water. The bodies of two loyal wolves lay still near the entrance. With a roar of pure, unadulterated rage, Kylan launched himself at the remaining vampires, a blur of fangs and fury. Marcus was a shadow beside him, his attacks brutally efficient. They made short work of the stragglers, but as the last vampire fell, Kylan saw several darker shapes melting into the forest, escaping to carry the news to Vargo. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The invaders were dead or gone, but the damage was done. Kylan stood amidst the ruin, his chest heaving, the sweet, poisonous dust settling on his fur like snow. The hope that had been so carefully nurtured over the past days lay shattered on the cave floor. He tilted his head back, and a howl tore from his throat. It was not the triumphant cry of an alpha, but a raw, agonizing sound of despair. It was the sound of a leader who had failed again. His knees buckled, hitting the soft earth with a dull thud. He had been so close. So close. Kylan. Miriam's voice was soft but firm. She approached him, not with pity, but with a steady calm. She placed a hand on his heaving shoulder. "Look at me," she said. He didn't move, his gaze locked on the destruction. "Kylan, they didn't get everything." The words were so unexpected they cut through his grief. He slowly turned his head, his golden eyes blazing with confusion and a flicker of desperate hope. "I had a feeling," she continued, a faint, shrewd smile touching her lips. "A foreboding. 2 days ago, I took a significant portion of the most potent batch. I've been processing it in a hollow by the creek, far from here. It's safe. The weapon, it's still being made." The weight crushing Kylan's chest vanished. He stared at her, this human girl who possessed more foresight and cunning than he had credited any human with. The howl of despair died in his throat, replaced by a sharp, disbelieving breath. You're sure?" he rasped. "I am. It's nearly ready. They only destroyed our decoy." A new sound filled the air, starting as a low rumble in Kylan's chest and growing into a fierce, determined growl. He rose to his feet, his body thrumming with renewed purpose. The setback was not an end, it was merely a test. He looked at Miriam, then at Marcus, whose own grim expression had softened into one of grim satisfaction. "How long?" Kylan asked, his voice now the clear, commanding tone of the alpha returned. 2 days, Miriam confirmed. "The pollen will be concentrated, ready for delivery." 2 days, Kylan repeated, his gaze turning from the wreckage of the lab and looking east, towards the dark silhouette of his stolen home. "Then we finish this. We reclaim our land, and we save our people." He was no longer a fugitive on his knees. He was a storm gathering its strength, and in 2 days, he would break upon Vargo's walls. Meanwhile, the great hall of the packhouse reverberated with a cacophony of cruel laughter and the clinking of glasses filled with dark, crimson wine. Lord Vargo, seated on the oak throne, surveyed his court with smug satisfaction. The air was thick with the scent of blood and victory. "A toast." Vargo's voice, smooth as silk, cut through the din, and silence fell immediately. "To the subjugation of the beasts. To a reign that will last for millennia." A chorus of cheers answered him. He smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "And what is a celebration without a proper feast? Bring out the captives. Let my most loyal servants drink their fill as a reward." The heavy doors to the dungeon creaked open, and a line of shackled werewolves and humans was shoved into the hall. Finn, his head held high despite the silver chains, glared at Vargo with undiminished hatred. The vampires leered, their fangs lengthening in anticipation. But just as the first vampire stepped toward a trembling human, a different sound echoed from outside the walls. It was not celebration. It was the sound of steel meeting steel, of snarling wolves, and of sharp, pained shrieks that were distinctly vampiric. Vargo's smile vanished. "What is that?" he hissed, his composure cracking. Before anyone could answer, the main doors to the hall burst open. A vampire guard, his uniform torn and his face a mask of panic, stumbled inside. "My lord, they're here. The Alpha Kylan. He's breached the outer defenses." Vargo shot to his feet, his face a contorted mask of fury. His eyes swept over the minion who had days ago reported the successful destruction of the lab. The one who had sworn the threat was eliminated. "You," Vargo's voice was a deadly whisper. "You told me they had nothing. You told me their hope was ash." The minion paled, trembling. "My lord, I saw the lab destroyed. I swear it. I don't know how." "A liar's tongue is a poisonous thing," Vargo snarled. In a blur of motion, he was before the terrified vampire. His hand shot out, piercing the creature's chest with a sickening crunch. He withdrew his fist, clutching the minion's still beating heart, and let the body drop. "I tolerate many things," he announced to the stunned court, "but failure disguised as success is not one of them." He turned to his captains. "Kill them all. Bring me Kylan's head." As his generals rushed out to command the defense, Vargo calmly returned to his throne. The party was over. The war had returned to his doorstep. Outside, the battle was a whirlwind of calculated chaos. Kylan's forces, though smaller, fought with the fury of the righteous. But their true advantage hung in the air, a faint, shimmering pollen, the sun's tears. Miriam's creation. As the vampires inhaled the gas, they choked, their supernatural strength faltering, their movements turning sluggish. It was like cutting through wheat. Kylan, a gray-furred tempest, fought his way toward the packhouse, Marcus a relentless shadow at his side. They carved a path through the disoriented enemy, their goal singular, the throne room. Bursting through the main doors, Kylan and his warriors found the remaining elite guard. The fight was short and brutal. Marcus and the others engaged the guards, giving Kylan a clear path. "He's yours, Alpha," Marcus roared, tearing out a vampire's throat. Vargo rose from the throne, his elegant demeanor replaced by a predator's rage. He saw his forces crumbling, his grand victory turning to dust. "You think this changes anything, dog?" he spat. "You are still an animal in a hall of your betters." Kylan shifted back to his human form, standing tall and battered before the vampire lord. "This hall was built by my bloodline. You are the trespasser. Then let us settle it." Vargo shrieked, his pride wounded beyond repair. "You and I. A duel for this kennel. Or are you afraid to face me without your tricks and your human poisons?" Kylan's eyes burned with cold fire. He raised a hand, stopping his men from advancing. "No one interferes." He knew this was more than a fight for territory. It was for the soul of his pack. It had to be him. The duel was a vicious ballet. Vargo was blindingly fast, his strikes like ice shards. Kylan was raw power, each blow meant to shatter bone. They were a storm of claws and fangs, a whirlwind of ancient hatred. Vargo landed a deep gash across Kylan's chest, but Kylan grabbed his arm and snapped it like a twig. Vargo screamed, his speed faltering for a critical second. That was all Kylan needed. He drove the vampire back, onto the dais, and with a final mighty surge of strength, he slammed Vargo against the great oak throne. From his belt, he drew a sharpened stake of rowan wood. "This is for my pack," Kylan growled. With all his strength, he plunged the stake into Vargo's chest. There was a moment of shock in the vampire's red eyes, a final, silent scream, and then his body crumbled into a pile of ancient dust that settled over the throne. Silence fell. The few remaining vampire guards, seeing their master destroyed, fled into the night. A howl went up from Finn and the freed captives, a sound of pure, unbridled triumph that was echoed by every wolf in the territory. The pack was restored. Weeks later, the great hall was filled once more with warmth and light. A feast, this time of roasted meat and honeyed mead, was held in honor of the fallen and the victorious. The human world, freed from the predations of the Sanguine Court, breathed a sigh of relief, their debt to the Ironwood Pack forever acknowledged. Kylan, standing before his people, raised his glass. His gaze found Marcus, his steadfast beta, and Miriam, the human whose wisdom had saved them all. "We are home," he said, his voice strong and clear, echoing in the hall that was truly his again. "And we are free."